My name is Rachel Voss. I am 29 years old. And on the afternoon of my sister's wedding reception, at 4:17 in the afternoon, a woman in a gray blazer stood up from table 11, walked to the center of the room, and introduced herself to 230 guests as Patricia Alderman, attorney at law, representing the estate of Margaret Louise Voss. The room went quiet, with the specific quality of quiet that happens when something entirely unexpected has entered a room where everyone was already holding a glass. My sister Amanda was standing near the head table in her dress. She turned when she heard the name, and I watched her face go through everything: confusion, recognition, calculation, and finally, the particular shade of gray that belongs to a person who has just understood that what they thought was finished is not finished and never was. The receipts Patricia was holding represented $203,480. Every cent of it had been my college fund. This is that story. Before I go any further, I want to ask you where you are right now. What city, what time of day? Drop it in the comments below, because I genuinely love knowing where these stories land. Whether it is an early morning somewhere in the Pacific Northwest with rain on the windows, or a late evening in the South with the ceiling fan turning, tell me. And if you connect with stories about women who were robbed by the people closest to them and who waited, quietly and completely, for exactly the right moment, hit like, hit subscribe, and stay with me. I have needed 2 years to be ready to tell this one, and I am going to tell every word of it. My full name is Rachel Marie Voss. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, the younger of 2 daughters of a man named Thomas Voss and a woman named Linda. Thomas was an electrician who ran his own small contracting company. Linda managed the books for his business and worked part-time as a dental receptionist for 15 years. We were not a wealthy family. We were a careful family, which is different and sometimes harder. Careful means you look at numbers. Careful means you know what things cost, and you plan for what you need. My parents were careful people, and the savings they had accumulated for my education represented years of that carefulness. Money set aside in small increments over more than a decade, in a dedicated education savings account that my parents had opened when I was 3 years old, and that my grandmother Margaret had contributed to every Christmas and every birthday for 22 years. My grandmother. I want to tell you about her before anything else, because the story does not make sense without her, and because she deserves to be introduced properly. Margaret Louise Voss was 83 years old at the time of this story. She had been a schoolteacher for 40 years in Western North Carolina, had never made a large salary, had never inherited anything significant, and had saved with the discipline of someone who understood that the future is built from what you do today rather than what you hope will arrive. She had 2 grandchildren, me and Amanda. She loved us both, in the way that grandmothers love their grandchildren, fully and without the conditions that parents sometimes attach to love. But Margaret had watched our family with the attention of a teacher who has spent 40 years reading between the lines of what children present versus what is actually happening. She saw us clearly. She had been seeing us clearly for as long as I could remember. My sister Amanda Grace Voss was 27 at the time of the wedding, 2 years older than me. Amanda was, in the operational taxonomy of our family, the one who felt things most. She was the louder one, the more social one, the one whose distress was treated as the household's most urgent variable. She had presence in the way that certain people have presence. Rooms arranged themselves around her. When Amanda entered a space, the space changed. I want to be precise about this. Amanda was not a bad person in the root sense. She was a person who had been taught, from an early age, that her desires were primary and that the people around her would find a way to accommodate them. She had learned this lesson so thoroughly that it had become invisible to her. She did not experience herself as taking. She experienced herself as needing, and needing felt to her like a natural state that justified its own fulfillment. I was the other one, quieter, more internal, better at school. When Amanda wanted something and did not have it, the household reorganized. When I wanted something and did not have it, I generally did not mention it a second time. That is not a complaint. It is a structural fact. And the structural fact produced, over years, a version of me that was more self-sufficient and less visible than I might otherwise have been, and a version of Amanda that was more entitled and less examined than was ultimately good for her. I want to give you more of the Amanda pattern in specific terms, because the pattern is important and I have been imprecise about it. Amanda did not steal from me in a single dramatic act. She asked for something that was mine to be given to her, and the family she had been trained to expect compliance from complied. The mechanism matters. The mechanism was a conversation at the kitchen table, in which Amanda presented her need with the full expectation that the people who had always reorganized around her needs would reorganize again. What made this particular need different from the previous ones, the borrowed car money, the deposit on the apartment that was never repaid, the certification program that ended after 6 weeks, was the scale. This was not a small ask. This was the entirety of a fund built over 22 years, contributed to by a grandmother with a teacher's savings, representing every birthday card and every Christmas envelope Margaret had ever sent. Amanda had looked at that number, $203,000, and she had asked for it. She had not, as far as I can determine, spent significant time considering what asking for it meant for the person it was intended for. That is not cruelty. I want to keep being precise about that. It is the specific failure that develops in a person who has been given everything she needed without being asked to consider the cost. The conversation my parents had told me about, the one at the kitchen table 8 months before my senior year, the one where Amanda had asked and my parents had initially said no, had gone on for several weeks before the final capitulation. Amanda had not accepted the first no. She had come back to the conversation repeatedly, adjusting her framing, adding new elements, revisiting the argument from different angles. My mother had told me, in fragments, over the months after the discovery. Amanda had said it was a loan. She had said Kevin's family would contribute. She had said the wedding planner had found ways to reduce costs. She had said that a wedding this significant only happened once, and that this was her dream, and that Rachel was young, and there was time, and there would be other ways to fund the education. The last argument, there will be other ways, is the one I return to most often. Other ways, as though the fund my parents had built for 20 years could be replaced by a vague gesture toward future possibility. As though careful people's careful savings were transferable to urgent desires without consequence. There are never other ways as good as the ones that already exist. Amanda had not thought about that. My parents, in their exhaustion and their inability to say no to the need in front of them, had not made her think about it. The college fund had been established by my parents when I was 3, as I have said, with contributions over the years from my grandmother Margaret. By the time I was 17 and beginning to apply to colleges, the account held $203,480. I know the exact figure because I have the account statements. My parents had been clear about it. This was my education fund, specifically mine, built over my entire childhood with the specific purpose of making it possible for me to attend the school that suited me best without the weight of debt. My grandmother had contributed consistently because she believed in education with the specific conviction of a woman who had spent 40 years teaching and who understood what the difference between a funded and an unfunded education does to a young person's options. I had been accepted to a school I wanted badly. I will not name it specifically, but it was a competitive program in environmental science in a city I had dreamed of living in, and the cost, including room and board for 4 years, was something the account could cover with enough left over to give me a foundation when I graduated. I had done the math. I had a plan. I had an acceptance letter. I had, I believed, a college fund. What I did not have, it turned out, was a college fund. What I had was an account that had been emptied. I need to tell you how I found out, because the how matters for the character of everything that followed. It was a Saturday morning in March of my senior year of high school, approximately 2 weeks before I needed to make my enrollment decision and submit the first tuition payment. I was at the kitchen table with my laptop and the university's financial aid portal open, about to walk through the payment setup with my mother. My mother was at the counter making coffee. She did not look at me when she said it. She said it to the counter, to the coffee, to the particular avoidance that people use when they have been dreading a sentence for a long time and have finally decided it has to be said. She said, "Rachel, there's something we need to tell you about the account." The account had been drained over the course of the previous 14 months. Amanda had a wedding coming. She had gotten engaged the prior year to a man named Kevin, and the wedding had been planned for the following spring. The wedding Kevin and Amanda had planned was not a small wedding. It was the wedding Amanda had described. in specific and detailed terms, since she was approximately 11 years old. A venue, flowers, catering, a dress that cost more than my first semester of school, a band, a rehearsal dinner, a honeymoon, 230 guests. The total cost, as I came to understand it, through my mother's halting and painful disclosure that Saturday morning, was somewhere between $200,000 and $210,000. My parents did not have that money. They had not budgeted for a wedding of that scale. What they had, accessible and earmarked and available, was the account they had built for my education. Amanda had asked for it. She had sat at the same kitchen table 8 months earlier and explained to my parents that the wedding she wanted was the wedding she had always described, that Kevin had a small family contribution, but nothing close to what they needed, that she had looked at everything, and the only way to make it work was the education account. She had framed it as a loan. She and Kevin would pay it back. She had said it was important. She had said it was her wedding, and weddings only happened once, and this was her dream. My parents had said no, initially. Amanda had pressed. My parents had relented, as they always relented, because Amanda's need had always been the weight that moved the scale. The money began moving within the month. By March of my senior year, the account was at $1,120. There was no wedding dress, no venue, no band that would fit in $1,120. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after my mother finished explaining. My mother was crying. My father had come into the kitchen at some point during the explanation and was standing near the door with his hands in his pockets and an expression I had not seen on his face before, which I came to understand was shame. He was a man who had been careful for 20 years and had, in one specific failure of will, undone the most important thing the carefulness had built. I do not think he stopped feeling that for a long time. I do not know if he has stopped feeling it yet. I did not cry at the table. I had the particular response to devastating information that comes to people who have spent their lives being the non-dramatic one. The information arrived, and I processed it, and I set it in a place inside me where it could be held still while I figured out what to do with it. I asked my mother one question. Does Amanda know that I know? My mother said, not yet. I said, then let's keep it that way for now. My mother looked at me with the expression of someone who has just realized they have underestimated what they raised. I want to pause here and say something directly to anyone watching who has just recognized their own family in this description. The specific combination of the parent who knows they failed you and cannot fully meet your eyes, and the sibling who took something from you and doesn't quite understand yet that the taking has a cost. If you know that combination, drop a comment below. Tell me you're here, and hit subscribe, because what happens over the next 12 months before the wedding reception is the part that required every ounce of patience I possessed. Patricia Alderman deserves a fuller introduction, because she was more than a person my grandmother hired. She had known Margaret for 18 years. They had met when Patricia handled the estate of a mutual friend, and the professional relationship had become something warmer over time. Not a friendship exactly, but the specific bond that forms between a woman who has devoted her career to protecting what people build and a woman who has spent her life building carefully. Patricia had children of her own, 2 daughters, both of whom she had put through college. She understood what the account represented. When Margaret had called her, in the weeks after I called Margaret, and explained what had happened and what she wanted to do about it, Patricia had said by her own account, "I'm in. Tell me what you need." She had spent the following month preparing the documentation, pulling the contribution records, the transfer statements, the account history, preparing the 47-page binder that would sit on the table at the reception. She had also done something else, which Margaret had not specifically requested, but which Patricia had decided was necessary. She had prepared a parallel document showing the comparative impact on my options. What the program I had been accepted to would have cost. What my earning trajectory might look like with versus without that degree. What the fund had represented in terms of life trajectory, not just dollars. This document was not presented at the reception. It was included in the binder. I found it at page 39 when I read the binder cover to cover the week after the wedding. It remains the most thorough accounting of what was taken from me that anyone has ever prepared, and it was prepared by a woman who had never met me until the reception, and who did it because she thought it was right. I need to tell you about my grandmother's reaction, because it was the hinge on which everything turned, and I want to be precise about when and how it happened. I called Margaret the evening of the Saturday kitchen table conversation. I did not know what else to do. She was 81 at the time. This was 2 years before the wedding, and she had been the primary contributor to the account for 22 years, and she had a right to know. I called her from my bedroom with the door closed. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything. She was quiet for a time that I could not have measured. Then she said, "Did your parents tell you, or did you find out another way?" I said, "Mom told me this morning." She said, "Good, that took courage." Another pause. "Rachel, I want you to listen to me carefully." I said, "I'm listening." She said, "You are going to college. I am going to make sure of that. And I am going to take care of the rest of it in my own way, in my own time. But I need you to do something for me." I said, "What?" She said, "I need you to be patient. I need you to not confront Amanda. I need you to go to school, do your work, and let me handle what I'm going to handle." I said, "What are you going to handle, Grandma?" She said, "I'm going to make sure that what was taken from you is accounted for properly." Her voice had the quality it got when she had made up her mind about something. A particular stillness, like a surface after a stone has already dropped through it and the ripples have not yet reached the edge. 3 weeks later, I received a letter from Margaret's attorney, Patricia Alderman's firm in Asheville. The letter informed me that my grandmother had established a dedicated education fund in my name, funded with $210,000 from her personal savings, to be administered by Patricia's firm specifically for my undergraduate and any subsequent graduate education, with the provision that any remaining funds at the completion of my education would transfer directly to me. The letter also contained one line that I have read many times since. It said, "Your grandmother asked me to tell you that she will handle the rest separately, and that you should not concern yourself with anything except your studies." I folded the letter, put it in the cedar box I keep on my desk, and started making my enrollment arrangements. I want to tell you about the 2 years between that letter and the wedding, because those 2 years were the container in which everything else was built. I started college in the fall. I threw myself into the environmental science program the way a person throws themselves into something when they understand, viscerally, that it was nearly taken from them. I was present. I was serious. I talked to Margaret on Sunday evenings, and she asked about my work, and I told her, in detail, and she listened in the way that teachers listen, not waiting for their turn to speak, but actually taking in what is said and returning something useful. She was proud in the specific, evidence-based way of a woman who has spent 40 years distinguishing between the performance of learning and the real thing. I want to tell you something about the first year of college, because the first year was its own story inside the larger story, and it belongs here. I arrived at my university in September with the specific gratitude of someone who had known, more viscerally than most arriving freshmen, how close they had come to not arriving at all. I was not dramatic about this. I did not tell my roommate or my classmates or the professors who would come to know me that the previous spring had included a Saturday morning in a kitchen that had rearranged everything. I simply arrived and I worked. The environmental science program was exactly what it had promised to be. Demanding, specific, full of people who cared about the same questions I had been caring about since I was 12 years old, reading about ecosystems in my grandmother's library. I was present for it in a way that I do not think I would have been if the path to it had been easy or assumed. When you have almost not had a thing, you understand its value in a different register than when it arrives as expected. I called Margaret every Sunday, as we had agreed. The calls were long, not in time necessarily, but in content. She asked me what I was learning, and I told her, and she asked follow-up questions that made me realize I had not yet thought something through completely, which was exactly the discipline she had been applying to young people's minds for 40 years. In November of that first year, I wrote a paper on watershed contamination patterns in the Southern Appalachians that my professor submitted, without telling me first, to a regional undergraduate research symposium. The paper was accepted and I presented it in January. Margaret drove 3 hours to be in the room. She sat in the third row with her hands in her lap, and she watched me present, and afterward she said, "Your grandfather would have understood every word of that." He had been a Forest Service ranger. It was the highest compliment she had in her vocabulary. I have not forgotten it. The second year brought a research assistantship that covered the gap between the account's coverage and my living expenses, which meant that by the time the wedding arrived in April of my second year, the account Patricia managed was not merely intact but had been supplemented by my own earning. I had built something alongside what Margaret had given me. That mattered in a way I had not anticipated, not because the money was significant, but because the building was mine, and it ran alongside the gift, rather than merely accepting it. I understood, in a way I had not fully understood before, what careful means. It means you add to what you have. It means you don't spend what you haven't built. During those 2 years, I visited home as I normally would, and I behaved at home as I normally would. I was cordial with Amanda. I went to her engagement party. I attended her bridal shower. I helped address invitations. Not with warmth exactly. There was a careful maintenance of function that required a certain amount of precision to sustain, but without the confrontation that Margaret had asked me to avoid. Amanda, for her part, behaved with me in the way she always had, warmly, somewhat carelessly, with the specific obliviousness of a person who has not examined what they took and therefore cannot see any reason why the person they took it from might be different. She was excited about the wedding. She talked about it constantly. She showed me photographs of the venue and the dress and the centerpieces, and asked for my opinion, and I gave it, measured and appropriate, while a part of me sat in perfect stillness and waited. I should tell you about Kevin before the reception, because Kevin is part of the story's texture. Kevin Marsh was 29 at the time of the wedding, a decent man in the limited way that people who are decent but incurious tend to be decent. He had a steady job in logistics management, a pleasant manner, and the particular quality of being entirely uninformed about the dynamics of the family he was marrying into. He did not know about the college fund. Amanda had not told him. I know this because of the expression on his face at the reception, which I will describe in a moment. Kevin was not a villain. He was a bystander in his own wedding, which is a sad thing to be. The wedding day arrived on a Saturday in April, the spring of my second year of college. The venue was a restored farm property outside Asheville, the kind with original oak floors and string lights, and a catering operation that had been running seasonal events for 10 years. 230 guests. The ceremony was in the afternoon, the reception to follow. I was a bridesmaid. I had been asked in the fall, and I had said yes because Margaret had not told me not to, and because I understood that the day needed to run normally for what Margaret had planned to mean anything. I stood in the front row in the pale green dress Amanda had chosen, and I watched my sister get married, and I felt the specific complexity of feeling something genuine. She was happy, genuinely happy, in a way I did not begrudge her, while also holding the other thing. The reception began at 3 in the afternoon, the venue filled with the particular warmth of 230 people who had come for a celebration. There was a band, as promised. There was a dinner that was extraordinary. There were speeches. Kevin's father, my father, a college friend of Amanda's who made everyone laugh. Amanda and Kevin danced to a song she had talked about dancing to for years. I danced with a groomsman and ate a plate of food that was genuinely excellent and thought about the fact that every item on the table, every flower and every centerpiece, every strand of the string lights had been paid for with money that was supposed to be mine. At 4:17 in the afternoon, as the room was settling into the warm, loose phase of a reception where the speeches are done and the dancing has not yet fully taken over, Patricia Alderman stood up from table 11. I had not known exactly when Patricia would stand. Margaret had not told me the specifics. She had said only when I had asked, directly, 3 weeks before the wedding, whether something was going to happen. Something is going to be said. I am going to make sure the right people hear it. Your job is to be present and to let it happen. I had said, "Okay, Grandma," she said, "I want you to see it. I want you to be there." I said, "I will be." Patricia Alderman was 62 years old. She was in the gray blazer she wore in every professional capacity, a woman who had spent 34 years practicing estate and trust law in Western North Carolina, and who had the specific bearing of someone who has said difficult things in difficult rooms for long enough that the difficulty no longer registers in her posture. She was 5'4" and she had the room in approximately 4 seconds from the moment she stood. The room quieted with the efficiency of people who do not know what is happening but understand something is. She said, "My name is Patricia Alderman. I represent the estate planning interests of Margaret Louise Voss, who asked me to be here today in a specific capacity. I apologize for the unconventional timing." Mrs. Voss was very particular about when and how this was presented. I watched Amanda's face from the bridesmaid position I had not moved from. I watched the sequence I described at the beginning of this story. The confusion, the recognition, the calculation, the gray. Kevin, beside her, had no sequence. He simply looked confused and remained confused for the next several minutes. Patricia continued. She was precise, and she was calm, and she said what she had been asked to say. She explained, in language that was entirely clear and appropriate for a room of 230 people who were not lawyers, that an education savings account established 22 years ago by Thomas and Linda Voss for the benefit of Rachel Marie Voss had been drawn down over a 14-month period, and its full balance of $203,480 had been redirected to fund this event. She said that Margaret Voss had been the primary contributor to that account and had provided documentation of her contributions to Patricia's firm. She said that Margaret Voss had responded to this situation by personally funding a replacement account for Rachel's education in the same amount, at a personal cost that represented a significant portion of her savings. She said that the purpose of this statement, made at this moment, was not to cause harm, but to create an accurate and witnessed record of what had occurred, because Mrs. Voss believed that things done in the light are different from things done in the dark, and that certain debts, if not acknowledged, have a way of reshaping families in permanent and damaging ways. She then placed on the nearest table a bound document of 47 pages containing the account records, the contribution history, the transfer records, and the bank statements showing the outflow. She said, "Copies are available. Mrs. Voss asked me to tell the family that she loves all of them. She also asked me to tell them that she expected better." The room held its breath for what felt like a full minute after Patricia sat down. I heard the band shift uncomfortably. I heard someone near the back set a wine glass down on a table with more care than the moment required. I want to stay with the moment in the room a little longer, because I think it deserves it. When Patricia said, "Your grandmother asked me to tell them that she expected better," the room was entirely quiet for a full 8 seconds. I counted. In a room of 230 people, 8 seconds of complete silence is an unusual thing. It means the air has changed. It means everyone in the room has processed something simultaneously, and no one has yet found the right response to it. The band had stopped between songs at some point during Patricia's statement. I do not know if this was deliberate or coincidence, but it meant the acoustics were clean, and Patricia's voice had reached every corner of the room without effort. The 47-page binder sitting on the nearest table was not a prop. It was a fact. 230 people could see it, and several had already leaned toward it. What I noticed in those 8 seconds was not Amanda's face, though I was watching it. What I noticed was the room's response to Amanda's face. The tables nearest the head table, the wedding party's families, the oldest friends, the people who had known all of us longest, were looking at Amanda with an expression that I can only describe as recalibration. Not condemnation, not judgment in the theatrical sense. Recalibration, the specific cognitive adjustment that happens when new information changes the structure of what you thought you understood. Amanda had been, for the entirety of the planning and execution of this day, the protagonist of an event that everyone had gathered to celebrate. In 8 seconds, the room had acquired a more complete picture. The picture was not flattering, but it was accurate, and accuracy has a quality that performance does not. You can feel it when it enters the room. It arrived with Patricia Alderman, and it stayed. Kevin's father, I learned later from my cousin who was seated at his table, had turned to his wife after Patricia sat down and said something in a low voice that my cousin could not fully hear, but that caused Kevin's mother to close her eyes briefly and press her lips together. Kevin's father was a man of 62 who had spent his career in business and who understood, from the first sentence of Patricia's statement, exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant. I have no relationship with Kevin's family and make no claim on their response. But I mention it because the room is the point. The room was the point Margaret was making. Things done in the light, I also want to tell you about one person in the room whose response I did not expect. My Aunt Carolyn, my mother's older sister, who had been at table 7 and who had known about the college fund situation for approximately a year, having been told by my mother in a moment of guilt the previous summer, stood up after Patricia sat down and walked to my table and stood beside me and put her hand on my shoulder without saying a word. She stood there for about 30 seconds and then went back to her seat. That was all. It was one of the quietest and most significant things anyone has ever done for me, and I have not forgotten it. Amanda said something. I did not hear the full sentence from where I was standing. What I heard was the end of it. This is my wedding. Patricia from table 11 said in a voice that carried. Yes. That is precisely the point. Kevin said something to Amanda in a low voice. She shook her head. My mother was sitting at the family table, and I could see her from where I was, and what I saw on her face was not surprise. It was relief, the specific relief of a person who has been carrying the knowledge of something wrong for 2 years and has finally had it lifted out of their hands by someone else. My father sat very still. The guests at the nearest tables were looking at their plates or their glasses or the middle distance with the studied attention of people who are processing something significant and have decided not to be seen processing it. I walked across the reception room to Margaret. She was at table 4, the family table where she had been placed by the seating arrangement Amanda had made. She was 83 years old in a blue dress she had bought for the occasion. She looked at me when I came to her and she said, "There it is." I sat down beside her. I said, "There it is." I took her hand. She squeezed it once the way she used to when I was small and she was telling me something was going to be okay. We sat together while the room recovered around us and the band played something quiet, and the evening moved forward with the uneven quality of an event that has had something large happen inside it and is not quite sure yet how to resume its intended shape. The aftermath of the reception played out over the weeks and months that followed. I want to be accurate about what actually happened rather than what might make a satisfying story, because accuracy is what this channel runs on, and because the truth, as it turns out, does not require embellishment. Amanda and Kevin did not speak to me at the reception after Patricia's statement. They left before the scheduled end of the evening, which I understand. The honeymoon was in Hawaii as planned. When they returned, Amanda called my mother. Then she called my father. Then she called me. The call to me came 11 days after the wedding on a Tuesday evening. Her voice had a quality I had not heard from her before. Not soft exactly, but different from her usual register, as though something in the confidence that had always animated her voice had been recalibrated. She said, "Rachel." I said, "Hi, Amanda." She said, "I need to say something to you." I waited. She said, "I knew what I was asking for when I asked Mom and Dad for that money. I didn't let myself think about what it meant for you. I didn't let myself think about it at all." She paused. That was wrong. Another pause. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I know that's not where we are. I just needed you to hear me say it." I sat with what she had said for a moment. I said, "I hear you." She said, "Is there anything you want to say to me?" I said, "Not right now. But I appreciate that you called." We stayed on the phone for another few minutes talking about nothing of substance, which was awkward and real in equal measure. And then we said goodbye. It was the most honest conversation my sister and I have ever had. I do not know yet what the relationship becomes from that honesty. I am giving it time. Kevin called my mother and asked, with what she described as genuine distress, why no one had told him where the wedding money had come from. My mother told him. He was, by her account, very quiet. He and Amanda have been in couples therapy since the fall. I do not know the content of those sessions, and it is not my business to know. What I know is that Kevin did not have the information, and that the information, once he had it, changed something in the architecture of their marriage that was already built. What they do with that changed architecture is theirs. I wish them, honestly, something better than what they started with. I want to give you one more piece of Margaret before I close, because I have not yet told you the most important thing about her. Margaret Louise Voss had not told me, when she called Patricia and established the replacement account, that doing so had required her to liquidate the majority of what remained in her personal retirement savings. I did not know this for several months. I found out not from Margaret, but from my father, who had found out from his brother, who had spoken to Margaret directly after the wedding about the situation. My father called me in June, 2 months after the reception, and said, "Rachel, I need to tell you something about your grandmother." He told me. He said it plainly, the way he says difficult things, without softening, because he has learned that softening them does not change them. Margaret had taken $210,000 from her savings to replace what had been taken from me. She had done this at 81 years old, with the knowledge that her remaining savings were reduced to what she needed for her living situation and her medical care. She had done it without telling me. She had not told me because she did not want it to change what the gift meant. She did not want me to receive it with guilt attached. She wanted me to receive it the way it was given, as an expression of what I deserved, not as a sacrifice that required managing. When I called her after my father's call, I asked her why she hadn't told me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because you would have spent 4 years studying on a fund that felt like a burden instead of a gift. And I didn't give it to you as a burden. I gave it to you as the obvious thing." I said, "Grandma, that was your retirement." She said, "I'm retired. I have what I need. What you needed was a different thing, and I had it, and I gave it." She paused. "Stop making a face." I laughed, which was the first time I had laughed in that particular conversation. She said, "I've been looking at your face since you were born. I know what you're doing." I said, "I'm going to do something with this, Grandma. I'm going to do something that matters with it." She said, "I know you are. That's why I gave it to you." We stayed on the phone for another half hour and talked about other things. The symposium, a hiking trail she'd been told about, a book she was reading. Before she hung up, she said, "Come visit soon." I said I will. I went the following month, and we sat on her porch for 2 hours in the afternoon light, and she told me about a student she had taught in 1982 who had sent her a letter the previous year from somewhere in South America, where he was doing conservation work. "That's what teaching is," she said. "You put something into the world and then you watch where it goes." I reached over and took her hand. She squeezed it once. My parents have been in a different place since the reception. My father called me in May, a month after the wedding, and apologized in the way that my father apologizes. Plainly without decoration, with the specific heaviness of a man who has looked at something for a year and has finally put words to it. He said he had failed me. He said he had known it was wrong when he let it happen, and had let it happen anyway. He said he did not expect me to understand that immediately, and that he understood if I needed time. I said I needed some time. He said that was fair. We have spoken every 2 or 3 weeks since. The conversations are not long. They are honest. They are the beginning of something different. My grandmother Margaret is 83 and still teaching, in the way that certain people never stop teaching. Not in a classroom anymore, but in every conversation she has with anyone who is paying attention. She calls me on Sunday evenings and asks about my work, and I tell her. I am in my 3rd year now. The environmental science program is everything I hoped it would be. The account Patricia administers has covered every expense with room left for the year ahead. When I finish, whatever remains goes to me directly. Ruth. Margaret, I sometimes call her Ruth in my mind, which is a habit I have picked up from a story I once heard that I found deeply familiar. Margaret built a thing. She built it for me. And I intend to be equal to it. I want to say something before I close that I think is important, and that I have been thinking about carefully. What Margaret did at that reception is something that people, when they hear this story, have strong reactions to. Some people think it was exactly right. Some people think it was too public, too severe, the wrong moment. I want to tell you where I land on that, because you deserve my honest assessment rather than a performance of certainty I do not feel. I think Margaret understood that private accountability had already been tried and had not worked. My parents had known for 2 years. Amanda had known she took money that was not hers. The private version of this story had no witness, and without witnesses, the private version can be rewritten. Margaret was a teacher for 40 years. She understood the difference between learning that happens in private and learning that happens in front of a room. She understood that certain facts, once witnessed, cannot be unwrapped. She chose her moment with the same precision she had brought to everything else. I do not think it was perfect. I think it was deliberate, and I think it was done from love. The specific, demanding, do-not-look-away love of a woman who had watched her family for 83 years and had decided that what she could still do, she was going to do completely. My name is Rachel Voss. I am 29 years old. I am in the third year of an environmental science degree that was nearly taken from me and was given back by a woman in a blue dress at table 4 of a wedding reception. My sister and I are finding our way towards something. My parents and I are finding our way towards something. Kevin and Amanda are finding their way towards something. None of those somethings are finished yet. That is the honest version of how these stories end. Not with resolution, but with the opening of the possibility of resolution, which is a different thing and takes longer and is, in my experience, considerably more real. Margaret is 83. She calls on Sundays. She asks good questions. I tell her the truth, which is what she has always asked of me, and the only thing she has ever asked of me, and which I intend to keep giving her for as long as she is there to ask. Thank you for staying with this. Drop a comment and tell me who in your life has ever done something for you that cost them more than you knew and that you only fully understood afterward. I want to read every answer. Hit subscribe because we have more of these stories, and every single one of them belongs to a woman who waited for the right room. I will see you in the next one.